All right. So this is kind of like what we've done previously. Okay. Like remember the first semester, what we built up to was first building this like ETL pipeline, right? Where we had a client class that then hit our Foursquare API. We then coerced the data using the venues adapter. And then we had the model layer, which when we hit save, right, that saved it into our Postgres database. So that was that's what we did initially. Then we went to deploy it, right? So we deployed our code on AWS. So we moved our code over to an EC2 instance, and if we invoked our code, like we had some sort of main or manage.py file, it would it would basically run this, right? Hit the Foursquare API and then save it in an RDS instance. So one problem with just the way we deployed the code, like the code itself is fine, but the way that we deployed it, having an EC2 instance and having an RDS instance, these things are always running. Okay, so this is a computer, right? This is a computer that you're paying for, and it's always on, unless you specifically pause it. But it's basically always going to be on and running, and you're paying for, you're renting it basically by like when the meter is running essentially. And then for the RDS instance, it's the same thing, right? This thing is always running unless you pause it or stop it or delete it. And same thing, the meter's running. So even when you're not performing any queries, you're not doing anything, you leave it on overnight, right? As you know, you just keep incurring more and more cost. The model that we're moving to is more of a like pay as you go type model, where like for example here, we won't always have a computer running, but right now we're using like our laptop. We're going to move away from that soon, but we're using like our laptop to make the request to an API, and then we're going to store our data in an RDS instance. Sorry, not in an RDS instance, in S3. My apologies. So we'll store it in S3. So just focusing on this layer, this is going to serve as our database layer. What we'll do is we'll store our data in S3, and then we'll use this service called Athena to query our data from S3. So what's the benefit of this is that with our RDS instance, remember this thing's always running, so we can't really decouple storage from the CPU, right? Like if we just want to like store some data, we're not just paying for storage, but we're also paying for a processor running in case we make a query, right? A SQL query. It needs to be able to respond to that. So this thing's actually is running on a computer. It's an EC2 machine underneath, but you're paying a good amount of money for this, even when you're not running any queries. In this case, we're just going to be we're separating the storage and the compute. Okay? So S3 does not have any CPU associated with it. It by itself is just a place to store files. All right, it's blob storage. I mean, we can like store whatever there, and it's relatively cheap. And you're not paying for a processor or a computer running the way you are with this. Okay. Instead, what we'll do is we'll use this service called Athena, and when we execute a query, Athena will then query our S3 bucket and literally can search through like a CSV file. Okay? So the benefit of this is there's nothing running overnight, you know? When we're not making a query, we're not really incurring costs. We're incurring a little bit of cost for S3 and zero cost for Athena. Okay? This is basically pay per query. Okay? So this is going to be pay per query, and we'll store our data in S3, and this is just storage, you know. So this is like, you know, it's just storage, and it's very cheap, very cheap. All right, to do this. So this is, like I said, we're basically these two things are kind of analogous. The difference is that with these services, you know, the EC2 machine, this computer is always running overnight even when we're not making requests with it. Our RDS instance is always running overnight even when we're not making requests with it. Another issue that generally occurs is as you scale up, say you store more data, the way to store more data oftentimes is by simply just duplicating your RDS instance. So if you just want to pay for more storage, you have to buy more CPU power as well. All right. So this coupling is not so fun, right? Can get to be costly. So that's a danger of it. And here we're saving on that by just paying for storage and separating out our compute. What's the downside of this? This is cheaper, right? We established that this is it's cheaper. I think per query, right? Like you're paying per query. So if you use a lot of these queries, the cost can still add up. The other thing you'll see is, this takes longer, right? Doing this the amount of time it takes to actually make a request, meaning perform a query and get back the response, is like a couple seconds, and you'll see this. So this is not going to work for like a transactional database. And like you can't perform certain optimizations like indexing or other kind of optimizations to make this quite good. So generally what you do, so anyway, we'll talk about this more, but this is just like a kind of initial type of data exploration mechanism using Athena and S3. But I did want to kind of explain the different architectures that we're moving through. Questions about, let me zoom out. Questions about this. I'll try to I'll take a screenshot of this and we can talk more about it. Just to talk a little bit more about Bado. So Bado's a library, right? A Python library that interacts with really any of your AWS services. So right now we're just using it for S3, but eventually we'll actually use Bado to connect to our Athena database, right? Which will then query our S3. We'll use Bado for other things as well. So this really is a Python library that we can integrate just in a code base as opposed to going through the AWS.com and clicking through stuff and doing everything through there. We can have all of our commands in one code base, and we can have this stuff talk to each other a little bit more easily, right? We can make a request from the request library and then take that data and then upload it, right? Upload that data into S3 all with the Bado library. So it's just, we can actually program, all the benefits we get of using code, doing things automatically, having different services talk to one another. We get that when we start using code again, right? That's the benefit here. One thing to mention is for these services to talk to one another, right? For like Bado to talk to S3, we need to set up our permissions, right? Because when you're using Bado, what you're really doing is you're using it as a user, right? As what's called an IAM user. So, how does your IAM user have access to S3 storage? And what if S3 wants to prevent access, to certain users? So, right there, these are different configurations that we can set up. So that's what we'll start to talk about, right? Is basically the different permissions, and you can see why we need to talk about this. Is because for each one of these services, Bado to talk to S3, Bado to talk to Athena, and then Athena to talk to S3. In between them are basically permissions that allow or deny for this. Okay, so that's like the next topic that we'll get into. Questions before we move into permissions?
Which one of these patterns would you say is more common, Jeff? I know they have different uses, but I don't know which ones use more.
Which of these two patterns?
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, there are different uses. Like if you want a running website, right? You have to use like a running API that someone can access like whenever they want. Well, I was going to say you have to use EC2, but that's not true, right? You can. You probably start with EC2, but you could, this I'd say is like easier to use and more standard. But eventually, Yeah, some people will start with like just using a pure Lambda function. So I'd say it really, I don't know which one. My sense is this is more common because it's more understood by most people. But it just mimics a normal computer. This pattern is probably a lot of people aspire, want to move into it because it's cheap. You pay as you go, right? So it's considered more scalable because as the number of requests to your website or you need to make more hits to an external API increases, you just scale up with it as opposed to paying like more or less a flat fee, right?
Okay. Okay.
Cool. Other questions? Yeah. One thing to note is, yeah, I mean, this is using like this is like our RDS instance, our EC2 user, like the hard drive is EBS storage. It's a different kind of storage than S3 storage. And the main difference is this is cheaper and this is faster, right? Like another difference is EC2 computer, you just simply, it is not hooked up to talk to S3 as a hard drive. You can only use EBS storage as a hard drive. All right, but there is a difference, and I can Slack you out like a Stack Overflow on them. All right, let's get into permissions. Okay, we'll just talk a little bit about it. So I have like a couple of code alongs that will have you can see I'm racking up some costs, that will have you, I think understand permissions better. The main thing, let me go back here, is there's kind of two different ways you can think of permissions. One is kind of an IAM role, like a user, right? And here the user we're going to define like what the user can access. And this I've heard too described as like a permission slip, right? You walk through the hallways like, okay, these are the different rooms you can walk in. And then finally, there's another way of setting permissions, and that's like on the resource. So here, like S3 can say who is allowed in or not, and that's kind of like a bouncer. Okay, so you can also have a bouncer say, I don't care what your permission slip is, you're not getting in. Okay, so there's two different ways you can set this up, right? I can be like, I'm a user, as this user, I should be able to access S3. But as we'll see, you can also put certain what's called like policies on the storage itself, where this S3 bucket specifies who is allowed in and who is not. All right, so those are the two different ways of thinking about this. So we're going to start with the user, like the IAM user, and we can go to IAM, and you can basically click on users, and then we can create a new user, and I'll call this my lecture user. And I want to provide access to the AWS console. So this is what's going to allow us to talk to Bado. And I want to create an IAM user. I don't think, actually, we recommend, okay, I don't really need a password or anything, I don't think. Oh well. Okay, and now here's kind of the next thing is we can attach policies to this user. So a user has many policies, and these policies are essentially like the permissions that the user is able to access. So the ones that I want two. One is like S3. We'll just give S3 read-only access. And then we'll also add this IAM, like the ability to actually view IAM, like view like the user itself, which we wouldn't be able to do if we don't explicitly state it. So this is what I want us to start looking at is, if you look at the policy, if I click this plus sign, expand the policy, hopefully you'll start to like understand this, okay? So the version is just the version of the API that we're using, right? Are we using version 1, version 2? It's just dated, right? This is the version of the API from 2012, October 17th. And then you can see the statement is the other key, and it has a list. It's really a list of dictionaries. So it's a list of statements. And we're saying, okay, we are going to allow, right? There's also an effect of deny. but here we are going to allow different actions. And notice these are actions on a resource, basically using like, similar to like a REST policy, right? So this is that on an S3 bucket, we can perform the get actions, meaning like, read from a bucket or read from an object. We can also perform like the list, list objects in a bucket. This is, this comes for free, I guess, with the read access. This is to access this other service called a Lambda that, like, when you upload basically some like an object to a bucket, it can trigger this Lambda function thing. You don't have to really worry about this yet. And then the resource, we could be, the star means obviously anything, right? The resource is any S3 bucket, but we could specify here, okay, this user just has access to, a specific S3 bucket, all right? So the resource is, okay, fine, are you getting access to anything? And here the answer is effectively yes. We're getting access to, these actions you can perform on any S3 bucket in our account. Okay. So like, again, like it just takes a moment, but hopefully you'll be able to start understanding this. So now we need to check this box to add this policy. And then I'll just give myself IAM read-only access. So this is the ability to like create users. Here it's read-only access, so we can just view, the users. And you can see we can, like, for example, get a list of the users in the account, like see what policies are associated with the users, things like that. Then I'll click next. I guess I had to give myself the ability to change the password. And then we can create the user. From here, if you go back to users, I don't really need it. I don't think. If you go back to users and like find the lecture user, the next thing that I'll ask you to do is be able to like work with this user from the Botto library, right? So the way to do that is, if you go to, if you type in AWS configure, I think it's -- profile. I'm gonna have to look at my notes. Oh, here it is, -- profile, and then you put the name of the user. So I'll go back to that in 1 second. I just want to see what it was. It was called my lecture user. So -- profile lecture user. Right, I'm gonna add this user as like an available user from my command line from Botto. Okay, so currently, like, we've only added one user, but we're about to add a second user, right? This lecture user. And you can see what you need to do is paste in your AWS access key in order to do this. So let me just, stop sharing for a second while I do this. I'm gonna go to, actually I'll show you this part. I'm going to go to click on security credentials, and then down here I can just click on create access key. All right, and then I'll say I'm going to use it for command line interface, and say I understand, and then click next, and then click create access key. All right, so now it gives me my access key and my secret access key, and this is what I'll just need to paste inside here. So let me do that. I have to pause. All right, so let me keep sharing. Kind of cool if you look at, and I wrote out some code for you all to work through, so I think it's pretty clear. But what we're doing here is we're connecting to S3's IAM service, okay? And then I can call something like get the current user, like who am I logged in as when I'm using Botto? And then we can print out the username here, and then we can list the policies of that user. So let's just do that now. I'll do -I. Oh man, I must have messed something up. So you can see unable to parse the file in .aws credentials. I messed something up real fast there. Sorry about that. If you change the file, you should exit out of Botto and then relog in. So let me just run this again. Yeah, so this is now working. So you can see, right, that and it's not super important that you like remember all of this, but I just want to show you, okay, I'm able to get the user and I can see that, hey, currently I'm logged in. The username is this lecture user, right, that we're now logged in as, right? And I did this by changing that credentials file, okay? And then the thing that I think you can go through this in the code along, but what you'll see is, because we only have read-only access, right? If you try to do something like, say, create a bucket, hold on, let's actually import. So we'll import the S3 client, and then we'll do s3.createAbucket. You'll see that this is working properly in that we have this access denied, right? Normally we don't get an access denied from, creating a bucket, but because we only have read-only access, that's denied. However, we can do something like, say, list the objects in one of my buckets, right? Because it's read-only. So that's kind of one thing to see, right? And again, this is that permission slip of adding policies on a particular user, all right? Another thing, though, is on the S3 bucket itself. So if you go type in S3, let's see, you can see I have these different ones. Let me do objects can be public. I think it's probably this one. What I did was, if you go to permissions, you see here I added a statement directly onto the bucket, okay? So let's try to understand this. So again, this looks very similar. It is very similar to what we saw on the user. We have version and statement. These are the two outermost keys. So this is the API version, and this is really a list of dictionaries for the statement. There's only one dictionary here, but we could have more than one. SID is the statement ID. This is just any text you want to put in there. And then again, we have this allow. The principal is who am I allowing access to, right? So remember, this is that bouncer, right, at the door, specifying the list of who is allowed access. So here, I'm only allowing, this user these abilities. Right, this only applies to this particular user. So I'm allowing the user, this IAM user, the ability to create objects. Put object is really creating an object, and then retrieving an object and deleting an object. All right, so these are the actions I'm allowing. And then I think this is a little silly, but or maybe I just don't fully understand it. I guess it's not so silly. You have to put it in the resource, right? You have to specify. This is the ARN, meaning the Amazon resource number of what this applies to. So this is how do I get this thing? It's just, if you go to, how do you get it? It should be, normally it's right, if I go to edit, I think it will be, see that they provide it for you directly. So they say, hey, you're probably going to need this thing. This is the Amazon resource number of the current bucket. Okay, so you can see it always begins like ARN, AWS, the service that the resource you're talking about, and then the specific identifier for it. The reason why they make you provide it is because you can provide just access to the bucket itself, or all bucket itself and all the objects in the bucket. So this is applying, because you see the /* at the end, this is saying, hey, this applies to all the objects in the bucket. We're allowing us the ability to get those objects themselves, not just the container, the bucket. We're also allowing access to the objects. All right, so that's kind of the idea here. It can be a pain in the neck to write out these things, as you might imagine. One thing to know is that there is this policy generator, which is pretty nice. Okay, so if you go to the policy generator. And then you can specify different kinds of policies that you want to write. So for instance, here's the S3 bucket policy. Who is the principal? Again, the principal is going to be By the principal, we mean who is the user that you want to allow this access to? Is it anyone, or that you want this a statement to apply to? Does it apply to anyone? Does it apply to just this guy? So here we'll just have it apply to this user. And then this is for the AWS service. It knows that because of this bucket policy. And then we can specify, okay, what are the abilities we're going to give them? So just to like generate it, I'll say create the bucket policy and say delete a bucket. And then what Amazon resource does this apply to? Let's copy this guy and paste this in here. All right. Remember, we can add multiple statements to a single policy. Like we could, say we have a policy of, creating buckets and then a separate statement for creating objects or whatever. Then let's click add the statement. And then finally, we can generate the policy. And you see this? Here it displays, right? It's created that JSON for me, which makes my life easier at least, right? But the idea is hopefully you can start reading this thing and understanding it. The reason why I go through this, why do I go through this? Because when you have problems with AWS, it's oftentimes problems with permissions, right? So taking an hour to understand this stuff or more, right, is going to save you a ton of time as you work with AWS. All right, so that's what these next code alongs are doing, is taking you through this and exploring a little bit more detailed about kind of, this bouncer analogy, right, of putting permissions on the bucket itself, and then also the permission slip analogy of, as a user, what access do you have? I know. Questions? Yeah, it's going to take some time. And it's not, even then, you'll be a little bit confused probably, but it will be less confused. I think you'll be able to understand the logic of all of the rest of the setup you have to do in the coming days with permissions.
So if we work in a company, or those access, do we get permitted or we create for other people?
If you can, like, as a account owner, you can create an other users there. I think like you can create other users for members of your organization, and that's probably what people will do, is they'll create certain abilities for you. I'm not sure. I guess different organizations will set it up differently. The other thing I think you can do is, like, say I log in, you can still connect to a third kind of organization, the same as like you log in as your GitHub user, but say you get permissions from an organization type of thing. Yeah. Did that answer your question or not really? I don't know. Taylor, how does it, if you're there, how did it work in your organization? Did they like assign you, I guess, a user and certain permissions?
Yeah, we'd have like an admin who made sure that you only had the certain amount of permissions that would be expected for a service that you're using. Like maybe they know you use Lambda and S3, so they'll give you the appropriate ones, but they would never give you like for all the buckets. It would be tied to specific ARNs every time.
Right.
I don't know if you.
Yeah, that's a good answer, right? So it's like, all right, when they give permission to something like this, they're not having that policy that says resource star, right? They're specifying the list of buckets or that you can access, right? And that's probably for your own good as well. Like you don't want, if something happens in one of those files or something gets revealed, like you don't want to be one of the people that gets questioned, or even if it was generally this stuff doesn't happen on purpose. It's just carelessness or whatever. So it's good just to only have access to what you need.
And the naming convention really mattered for my agency, where we have to have a 4-letter code at the beginning of everything we create. And then when they give us access, they just give us access to like that code, because there's a lot of different projects at my organization. So that was the way that they
managed it. Yeah. Like in IAM, so you can see, like, here's the different policies. And you can create custom policies, which is what we'll do. So a user, you can attach policies to a user, right? When you, I guess, give access to the policies, I guess what you're saying is, you see here, it's like the resource, these different colons, it's kind of like a file system. So if we say, hey, you have access to all the 4 digits under this directory, you're basically giving access to like S3 buckets. In this case, I guess maybe this is a better example, like S3 buckets under this folder, right? That's what, you'll get access to if you're part of a certain team. All right. Well, that was a start.